Friends, I want you to imagine waking up in an empire that is so powerful, it literally feels invincible.
Just completely untouchable.
Exactly. Like the weather outside is flawless, just like it was yesterday, and just like it will be tomorrow. The economy is absolutely roaring. Your civilization's borders stretch so far across the globe that the very idea of a foreign threat is basically a myth.
Right, it's a joke to them.
Yeah. You are standing at the absolute apex of human achievement. And then, within the span of just a few short years, half of everyone you know vanishes.
Oh, man.
The sky above you goes completely dark. And I don't mean for a night, I mean for months on end.
Just a total nightmare scenario.
And the empire just shatters. But friends, here is the most terrifying part of this entire scenario. No massive invading army caused this collapse. The weapons that brought down this superpower, they weren't made of iron or steel.
No, they were microscopic.
Exactly. They were microscopic poisons, invisible pathogens, and a really subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the wind.
It honestly sounds like the opening scene of some post-apocalyptic thriller, but it is entirely real.
So real. Welcome to our deep dive, friends. Today, we are unpacking the absolute perfect storms of history. We're looking at the lethal, unstoppable forces of nature that dismantled the world's greatest civilizations.
Yeah, we are going to examine the exact mechanisms of how disease, climate change, and just catastrophic environmental arrogance wiped out millions.
And more importantly, we are going to look at what those events reveal about the terrifying fragility of the ground that we are all standing on right now.
We've got a massive stack of historical records, ice core data, and epidemiological research today to figure out the actual mechanics of civilizational collapse.
Right, because we are moving far beyond those standard textbook stories of bad emperors and barbarian invasions. We are looking at the invisible assassins.
The silent killers.
So strap in, friends. Because we are starting our journey in the year 165 AD, the Roman army is marching home from a massive, victorious campaign in the Middle East, completely unaware that they are functioning as a delivery mechanism for their own doom.
To truly grasp the sheer scale of the horror that is about to unfold, you have to understand the baseline. Like, you have to understand how spectacularly good the Romans had it right before this moment.
Oh, they won the lottery.
They absolutely did. From about 200 BC up to the 2nd century AD, Rome was experiencing a geographical and meteorological lottery win. Climatologists actually call it the Roman climate optimum.
Let's break down the mechanics of that because, well, climate optimum sounds like a really mild, pleasant thing.
Right, like a nice spring day.
Yeah, but in the ancient world, weather is destiny. How does a slightly better climate translate into the greatest empire on Earth?
It translates directly into a massive caloric surplus. I mean, the climate during this period was unusually warm, remarkably stable, and predictably wet across the Mediterranean.
Which is everything if you're farming.
Exactly. If you are a Roman farmer, you know exactly when the rains will come. Abundant, predictable rainfall means massive, compounding harvests across regions like North Africa and Egypt.
Which functioned as the breadbasket of the entire empire.
Right. Nature was essentially subsidizing the Roman military.
Because if you have a massive caloric surplus, your population naturally booms. And a booming population means you don't need every single person working the fields just to survive.
You have excess labor.
Exactly. You can take hundreds of thousands of young men, hand them swords, and turn them into a permanent, professional standing army without starving your cities.
And that standing army goes out and conquers more territory, which brings in more wealth, more enslaved labor, and more tax revenue.
Which is then used to build more aqueducts and roads to support an even larger population. It is essentially a self-sustaining feedback loop of unprecedented geopolitical growth.
Fueled entirely by perfect weather.
It is the ancient equivalent of compound interest. But friends, here is the fatal flaw in that system. A machine that highly tuned, that dependent on constant expansion and perfect conditions, it's incredibly brittle.
So brittle.
The rot that eventually hollows out the Roman Empire, it doesn't start with someone breaching the walls. It starts inside their own bloodstreams.
Yeah. In 165 AD, Emperor Marcus Aurelius is dealing with a conflict in Parthia, which is modern-day Iran. And the Roman legions do what they do best.
They march in, they sack the cities, declare total victory.
Exactly. And they begin the long march back to Rome. But they picked up something completely foreign during that campaign, a mystery pathogen that historians call the Antonine Plague.
The ancient sources describe the symptoms, and friends, they read like an absolute nightmare. Imagine you were in a crowded Roman military encampment.
Just packed shoulder to shoulder.
Right. Suddenly, the soldier next to you spikes a massive fever. Then, an intensely painful, blistering rash erupts across his entire body.
It sounds horrifying.
Within days, he is coughing up blood, suffering from severe internal bleeding, and experiencing violent diarrhea. And it just swept through the tightly packed legions.
And then right into the dense, cosmopolitan cities of the empire with astonishing speed. Epidemiologists today heavily debate what it was. Many suspect it was an early, incredibly virulent strain of smallpox.
The death toll was staggering. We were talking about 5 to 10 million people dead.
That was roughly 10% of the entire population of the Roman Empire just wiped off the map.
In some military units, the mortality rate approached nearly 50%. 50%.
Which is just catastrophic for a military.
Right. Stop to think about the logistics of that for a second. Friends, if you are the Roman emperor, your entire geopolitical strategy relies on projecting force along thousands of miles of borders.
But your military camps have basically turned into hospices.
Exactly. Your soldiers are bleeding from the mouth and dying in their tents faster than the enemy can kill them. How do you even begin to manage border defense when half your army is suffocating on their own blood?
Well, you don't. And this is where we need to look at the cascading systemic failure. Because a 10% population loss isn't evenly distributed.
Right. It hit the military and the urban economic hubs the absolute hardest.
Yeah, and when you lose that many soldiers, you desperately need replacements. So what do? You have to conscript farmers.
But wait, if you conscript the farmers, who is planting the wheat?
Nobody. The fields just go fallow. The crops rot in the ground. The sudden drop in agricultural output means the food supply to the cities completely collapses.
And when the cities can't eat, commerce stops. When commerce stops, the state cannot collect taxes.
And when the state cannot collect taxes, it cannot pay the remaining soldiers.
It is a total unraveling of their supply chain. It's honestly like a modern corporation where the manufacturing plant, the accounting department, and the security team all just walk off the job on the exact same day.
Total paralysis. And this wasn't even an isolated incident, because just as the empire is slowly trying to rebuild its population, another invisible wave hits around 250 AD.
The plague of Cyprian.
Exactly. And this one was so severe that it didn't just kill peasants and soldiers, it literally killed Roman emperors.
Wow.
The societal structure buckled under the weight of this second mass casualty event, which plunged the state into a massive 50-year civil war known as the Crisis of the Third Century.
But the Romans, they were exceptionally stubborn. They were master engineers and administrators.
They really were.
If they had only been dealing with biological pathogens, they might have eventually stabilized the ship. But then, the universe completely changed the rules of the game. Because, friends, the sky literally went dark.
This is where modern scientific forensics completely upends our understanding of history. By drilling deep into the Greenland ice sheet and examining the chemical composition of ancient ice cores.
Along with analyzing the rings of thousand-year-old trees, right?
Yeah, climatologists found the smoking gun. Around 130 AD, the perfect weather of the Roman climate optimum started to wildly fluctuate. But in the mid-6th century, it culminated in a catastrophic era we now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age.
Friends, put yourselves in the shoes of an ancient farmer. It is the year 536 AD. You are looking up at the sky, and something is terribly, terribly wrong.
It's jet black.
There is a dark, oppressive canopy of ash covering the entire hemisphere. And it doesn't dissipate in a day or a week. The sun barely shines for 18 months.
It is a constant, eerie twilight at noon.
What were they actually experiencing there?
Well, they were experiencing the fallout from a series of massive cataclysmic volcanic eruptions in the northern hemisphere, likely starting in Iceland and North America.
Wow.
These eruptions violently ejected millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, which created this massive aerosol veil that reflected solar radiation right back into space. Global temperatures plummeted by almost 2 degrees Celsius.
Now, friends, 2 degrees might sound totally trivial if you're just looking at a thermostat in your living room.
Right, you'd just put on a sweater.
Exactly. But in the context of global agriculture, 2 degrees is an absolute death sentence. Think about the modern just-in-time supply chain. We've all seen what happens when a single shipping canal is blocked for a week.
The global economy just panics.
Now imagine a scenario where the growing season across the entire known world is suddenly slashed in half.
The physics of agriculture completely broke down. Wheat and barley simply could not mature without sufficient solar radiation and warmth.
So the crops just withered in the frost.
Yeah, and without grain, the livestock starved. The cost of basic staples skyrocketed overnight. We are talking about mass, unmitigated starvation tearing through the lower and middle classes at a speed that medieval infrastructure could not possibly manage.
You have millions of starving people abandoning the freezing cities, wandering the countryside, searching for roots and bark, while the edges of the empire are just collapsing inward.
It's bleak.
But the nightmare was only just beginning, because starvation heavily compromises the human immune system. And waiting in the wings was the most efficient biological killer the ancient world had ever encountered.
We arrive at the year 541 AD. This is the plague of Justinian. And we really need to be clear about what this was. This wasn't a severe influenza or a mysterious rash.
No.
This was Yersinia pestis, the true, terrifying bubonic plague.
It hitchhiked its way into the Mediterranean on the backs of rats, hiding deep inside the holds of Egyptian grain ships.
Right, looking for food.
When those ships docked in the massive ports of the empire, the rats ran down the mooring lines, carrying fleas infected with the bacteria. The accounts we have from historians like Procopius, who actually lived in the capital city of Constantinople during the outbreak, are genuinely haunting.
Yeah, Procopius writes about a city descending into absolute madness. The mortality rate was so aggressive that all civic functions just ceased.
The gravediggers were quickly overwhelmed.
Completely. When the cemeteries filled up, they started packing corpses into the guard towers of the city walls until the smell became unbearable.
Oh my God.
Eventually, they resorted to digging massive trenches across the water in Galata, throwing tens of thousands of bodies in at a time.
He describes entire households, from the servants to the aristocrats, just being wiped out in a matter of days. Constantinople, which was the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, lost roughly half of its total population.
It literally became a silent, rotting ghost town.
Emperor Justinian himself actually contracted the bubonic plague, and in a bizarre twist of biological fate, he survived.
Which is wild!
He woke up from his fever dreams, his body scarred, only to look around and realize the empire he governed was functionally dead.
There were no laborers left to harvest what little food could grow in the volcanic winter. There were no taxpayers to fund the state.
The military apparatus had completely dissolved.
It is a profound psychological horror. I mean, surviving the apocalypse only to inherit the ashes.
But friends, here's the most insidious part of the Roman story. You'd think starvation and plague were enough, right? But the Roman elite, the generals, the senators, the emperors, they were also unknowingly poisoning themselves every single time they sat down for dinner.
Ah, the famous Roman lead problem, or as they called it, plumbum.
Yes. Now, most people have heard the pop history theory that the Romans went crazy because they used lead water pipes, the fistulae, for their plumbing.
Right, that's the classic fun fact everyone shares.
But the actual sources reveal a massive twist. The Romans weren't ignorant about the pipes. They knew lead was toxic.
They absolutely did. The famous Roman engineer and architect Vitruvius wrote entire treatises explicitly warning the public against using lead for water transport.
He pointed out that the laborers who smelted lead had pale complexions and suffered from severe neurological and physical illnesses.
Yeah, he strongly advocated for using clay pipes instead. So the engineering class knew. But the pipes aren't even the real culprit here, because calcium buildup from the hard Roman water quickly coated the inside of those pipes, basically preventing most of the lead from leaching into the drinking water.
The true horror was culinary. It was a luxury syrup called sapa, or di frutum.
This is where the story turns into a bizarre psychological thriller. The Roman aristocracy was totally obsessed with a very specific, intensely sweet flavor profile.
And to achieve this, they would take unfermented grape juice and boil it down for hours until it reduced into a thick, sweet syrup. They used this syrup to sweeten their wine in their food.
But the recipe absolutely required boiling the grape juice in lead vessels.
Why lead specifically?
Because when you boil highly acidic grape juice in a lead pot, the acid strips the lead right from the metal, creating a chemical compound called lead acetate.
Which is literally known as sugar of lead. It tastes incredibly sweet, but it is a potent, devastating neurotoxin. And the Roman elites were intentionally brewing it and pouring it into their wine goblets every single night at their banquets.
The biomedical reality of this is just terrifying. Modern analysis of ice cores from the Roman period shows massive atmospheric lead pollution, primarily from their vast silver smelting operations in Spain.
So the average citizen was already dealing with ambient lead exposure.
Right, but the elites, the decision makers, were microdosing themselves with a severe neurotoxin on a daily basis.
Let's look at the biological toll of that. Heavy, chronic lead exposure causes severe cognitive decline. It causes a drop in IQ, extreme mood swings, paranoia, infertility, and chronic physical pain.
You have a ruling class that is slowly, organically losing its collective mind.
Now, friends, a critical thinker might ask, if they were consuming this lead-laced wine for centuries, why didn't the empire collapse in the first century? Why did it take so long?
Exactly. If you are a Roman senator in 100 AD drinking the exact same poison wine as a senator in 400 AD, why is only one of you experiencing the fall of Rome?
Because lead poisoning wasn't the sole killer, it was a compounding variable.
Think of it as a structural weakness in the foundation of a massive building. For centuries, the weather was perfect, the economy was booming, and the tax revenue was overflowing.
The empire had enough momentum and wealth to basically mask the erratic, paranoid decision-making of its elite class. The system could afford a few bad leaders.
But then the environment turns hostile. The volcanoes erupt. The crops freeze. The bubonic plague wipes out the tax base and the military.
Suddenly, the margin for error drops to absolute zero. That is the exact moment an empire requires its leaders, its generals, and its administrators to be at peak cognitive performance.
They need to make brilliant, rapid strategic adaptations, but they can't.
Because their nervous systems are degraded.
Exactly. They are sluggish, paranoid, and incapable of grasping the massive logistical complexities of the crises crashing down around them.
It is the ultimate perfect storm. The plagues decimated the human capital. The climate shift destroyed the energy grid, which was the agricultural surplus, and the lead poisoning dismantled the decision-making software of the ruling class.
The borders simply dissolved. The Germanic tribes from the north, who were fleeing the exact same freezing temperatures and starving fields, looked at the Roman frontiers and realized the guards were dead, and the generals were too confused to mount a defense.
They didn't have to conquer Rome. They literally just walked through the decaying gates.
Rome's collapse wasn't an explosive event. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation. Nature introduced a series of compounding stressors that completely overwhelmed human capacity for adaptation.
But friends, that raises a terrifying question. What happens when a plague hits a society that is rapidly globalizing and densely packed? We don't have to guess. We just have to look at the 14th century. Because the invisible killers didn't disappear with the Romans. They just upgraded their transportation network.
Yeah, to understand the cataclysm of the Black Death, you really have to look at the geopolitical map of Europe and Asia in 1347. The Mongol Empire had effectively unified the Eurasian landmass, creating unprecedented political stability across the continent.
Which sounds like a good thing, right?
You'd think so. This stability allowed the Silk Road to flourish. Trade was flowing from the deep east into Europe at a massive, accelerated volume.
Picture the port city of Messina in Sicily, friends. It is loud, it is chaotic, and it is incredibly wealthy. Massive merchant galleys are arriving daily, their holds packed with luxury goods, silks, spices, and perfumes from the east.
But deep in the dark, damp cargo holds of those ships, hiding among the grain and the textiles, are black rats.
And feeding on the blood of those rats are fleas carrying the Yersinia pestis bacterium.
The very mechanism that made Europe wealthy, the hyper-connected, globalized trade network, became a biological superhighway.
Because the pathogen had been circulating in isolated pockets in Central Asia, but the Silk Road provided a direct, high-speed conduit right into the most densely populated, unsanitary urban centers of medieval Europe.
When the plague made landfall, it unleashed a level of trauma that is almost impossible to comprehend today. The symptoms detailed in the medieval chronicles are incredibly visceral.
It starts with a sudden spiking fever. Then the victim develops buboes, massive, agonizingly painful, black and purple swollen lymph nodes in the groin, the neck, and the armpits.
The bacteria was aggressively attacking the lymphatic system, and once it reached the lungs, it became pneumotic, meaning it could spread directly from person to person through aerosolized droplets in the air.
Victims would violently cough up blood. From the moment the first symptom appeared, death usually followed within 2 to 7 days.
Imagine the psychological terror of that speed. You speak to your neighbor on a Tuesday, and by Friday, his entire family is dead.
Up to 60% of the population in major European centers was just annihilated.
The societal infrastructure snapped instantly. The religious and civic institutions that held medieval life together completely dissolved.
Priests, who were expected to give last rites to the dying, were infected at massive rates, leading many to simply abandon their parishes out of sheer terror.
The accounts describe mountains of rotting bodies piling up outside the city walls because the consecrated ground in the graveyards was completely full.
The air in these cities literally smelled of death. When a society experiences that level of inexplicable random slaughter, human psychology completely breaks down.
People desperately need a narrative to explain the chaos. They need someone to blame.
And in a pre-germ theory world, that desperation morphed into horrific violence.
Yeah, conspiracy theories spread rapidly across Europe, falsely claiming that Jewish communities were intentionally poisoning the communal wells. This led to massive, organized pogroms.
Thousands of Jewish people were rounded up and burned alive by terrified mobs just looking for a scapegoat.
Others looked inward, believing the plague was a divine judgment, a manifestation of God's absolute wrath.
You saw the rise of the flagellant movement. Massive hysterical crowds of people marching from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with iron-tipped scourges.
Just tearing their own flesh apart in a desperate attempt to repent for humanity's sins and stop the dying.
It was an era of total psychological despair. But history is rarely one-dimensional, because out of this apocalyptic destruction came an incredibly profound, entirely accidental economic revolution.
Right, the Black Death completely rewired the power dynamics of human labor.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that economic flip, because it's fascinating. Before the plague hit, Europe was heavily overpopulated relative to its agricultural output. Land was the ultimate premium asset, and human labor was practically worthless.
Because there were always 10 starving peasants willing to do the job, the feudal lords held absolute tyrannical leverage.
But suddenly, the demographic math inverted. 60% of the workforce was dead in the ground. But the physical assets, the massive estates, the fertile farmlands, the mills, the looms, they were completely untouched by the bacteria.
The capital remained, but the labor evaporated.
Think of it like a massive overnight demographic stock market crash. The supply of human labor plummeted, which meant the value of the surviving peasants absolutely skyrocketed.
Exactly. For the first time in centuries, the peasantry realized they had leverage. The surviving workers looked at the local baron and realized he was helpless without them. The crops were rotting in the fields.
So the peasants demanded higher wages. They demanded lower rents. And if the lord refused,
They just packed up and walked to the neighboring estate because that lord was desperate enough to pay double.
it was a massive, brutal restructuring of the economy, driven purely by supply and demand. It's like a sudden, extreme minimum wage hike, driven not by laws, but by pure, brutal math.
The lords desperately tried to pass laws freezing wages to pre-plague levels, but the sheer economic reality overrode the legislation. It broke the back of the feudal system.
The consolidation of wealth among the survivors led to better diets, increased social mobility, and eventually the rise of a mercantile middle class.
The immense surplus wealth that flowed into the hands of the survivors actually helped fund the artistic and intellectual explosion of the Renaissance.
The modern economic world, in many ways, was fertilized by the bodies of the Black Death. But friends, the Black Death moved at the speed of sailing ships and horse carts. It took years to slowly crawl across the map of Europe.
Keep that pace in mind.
Exactly. Because what happens when a virus hitches a ride on modern trains and troop transport ships during the world's most devastating war?
We jump forward to the year 1918. The world is heavily industrialized, and is tearing itself apart in the muddy, freezing trenches of World War I.
Millions of men are mobilized globally. And right in the middle of the artillery barrages and the mustard gas attacks, a new microscopic killer emerges: the Spanish flu.
But first, we need to correct the greatest misnomer in medical history. It did not originate in Spain.
Right. Spain was a neutral country during World War I. Because they weren't involved in the fighting, their government didn't enforce the strict press censorship that the warring nations did.
Yeah, the United States, Britain, France, and Germany all aggressively censored their newspapers. They refused to print anything about a mysterious, highly lethal flu decimating their military ranks.
Because they were absolutely terrified of destroying wartime morale.
Exactly. Spain simply reported the truth about the outbreak happening within its borders, so the entire world falsely assumed Spain was the epicenter.
So it's a masterclass in how political censorship creates historical distortion. But let's look at the actual mechanics of the virus. It was an incredibly aggressive H1N1 influenza A virus, and the environment of late World War I was basically a custom-built laboratory for a superspreader event.
You have millions of young men packed shoulder to shoulder in wet, freezing, rat-infested trenches. Their immune systems are severely compromised by stress, lack of sleep, and poor nutrition.
When the virus hits these trenches, it burns through the ranks. But the true catastrophic error was the logistics of the war itself.
Right, the military logistics networks functioned as a global distribution system for the virus.
You have infected soldiers packed tightly into train cars, coughing on each other for days, traveling across continents. Then they are loaded onto massive troop transport ships to be rotated off the front lines.
Or sent back home to civilian populations across the globe. We essentially built a high-speed transit network for the pathogen.
But the most terrifying aspect of the 1918 pandemic wasn't just how fast it spread. It was who it killed. We all know the standard epidemiological curve of a seasonal flu. It is U-shaped.
Right, it heavily targets the most vulnerable populations, the very young infants whose immune systems are undeveloped, and the elderly whose immune systems are failing.
But this specific H1N1 virus flipped the script entirely. It created a W-shaped mortality curve. It was slaughtering perfectly healthy, robust young adults between the ages of 20 and 40.
These were men and women in the absolute prime of their physical lives.
The medical accounts from the military triage tents are just harrowing. Doctors were completely baffled. A young, incredibly fit soldier would walk into a field hospital complaining of a headache and a fever.
And within hours, they would develop cyanosis.
Cyanosis is when the skin literally turns a deep, horrifying shade of blue or purple.
Because the lungs are so severely compromised that oxygen can no longer enter the bloodstream.
These patients were literally drowning in their own bodily fluids. The sheer speed of the deterioration was staggering. A person could wake up feeling perfectly fine and be dead from suffocation within 24 to 48 hours.
But why was it specifically killing the strongest demographic?
This is where the biology gets incredibly dark. It involves a mechanism called a cytokine storm.
Exactly. A cytokine storm is a biological paradox. When this novel, highly aggressive virus entered the lungs of a healthy young adult, their immune system immediately recognized it as a massive threat.
And because these young adults had incredibly robust, powerful immune systems, they mounted a catastrophic overreaction.
The body sends a massive uncontrolled flood of immune cell cytokines into the lung tissue to aggressively fight the infection.
But the inflammation is so extreme, so violent, that it destroys the lung tissue itself. The lungs just fill with fluid, blood, and dead cells.
Ironically, it was the sheer strength of their immune systems that killed them. The weaker immune systems of the elderly didn't trigger this massive, fatal inflammatory response.
Which is why the elderly survived at much higher rates. The virus weaponized the vitality of the youth against them.
The global death toll is almost too massive to process. We are talking about an estimated 50 million people dead worldwide in a matter of months.
That is more than double the number of people killed by the actual combat of World War I. Entire communities were erased. In isolated places like the Pacific Islands, India, and remote Alaska native villages, the mortality rate was so absolute that it essentially wiped out the entire adult population.
Leaving behind villages populated entirely by freezing, starving orphans.
If we pull back and look at the macro-level lessons of 1918, friends, the parallels to our modern era are profoundly unsettling. The Spanish flu taught the world brutal lessons about transparent reporting, quarantines, and the need for rapid vaccine development.
It proved that trying to hide a virus to protect morale only ensures that the virus spreads faster and kills more effectively.
And it proved that no matter how industrialized or technologically advanced a society becomes, biology will always exploit the networks we build.
We build global shipping lanes for commerce, and pathogens use them for transmission.
It is a humbling reality check.
Right.
We cannot control nature. Microscopic pathogens are always a step ahead. But friends, sometimes civilization doesn't need a plague to collapse. Sometimes they just eat their own environment alive.
Yeah, let's leave the freezing trenches of Europe and travel deep into the sweltering, incredibly dense jungles of Central America.
We are shifting our focus to the classic period of the Mayan civilization. And the very first thing we need to do is entirely discard the myth that the Mayans were a sparse collection of tribes living in harmony with the jungle.
Oh, absolutely. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the Mayan lowlands were an incredibly complex, sprawling, hyperdense concrete jungle.
I want you guys to visualize standing in the massive central plaza of a city like Tikal or Copan. You aren't looking at a few huts. You are looking at gargantuan, perfectly engineered stone temples that pierce right through the dense jungle canopy.
Reaching straight up to the sky.
The city's gleaming white, reflecting the sun. The plazas are bustling with tens of thousands of people. The markets are packed with merchants trading jade, obsidian, and cacao.
You have powerful kings projecting absolute authority. It was an era of unprecedented architectural and cultural achievement.
But beneath the surface of that golden age, A massive, ticking time bomb was slowly counting down.
It was a brutal, unavoidable mathematical reality. Overpopulation in a constrained environment.
You have millions of people packed into these dense, lowland urban centers, and every single one of those people needs a massive amount of calories every single day.
And you are trying to generate those calories in a tropical rainforest. Jungle soils are notoriously thin and nutrient poor.
So to feed millions of people, the Mayans had to resort to incredibly aggressive, highly engineered agricultural tactics.
They utilized massive slash-and-burn farming to constantly clear new land. They built sprawling networks of raised fields in the swamps and massive hillside terracing.
Just to extract every possible ounce of agricultural yield from the landscape. But here's the piece of the puzzle that always breaks my brain. They are living in the middle of one of the most densely forested regions on the planet. How is it physically possible for a society living in a jungle to run out of trees?
It seems totally counterintuitive, but it comes down to the sheer scale of their industrial consumption. They weren't just cutting down trees to plant maize. They needed constant, massive amounts of wood for cooking fires for millions of people.
Right.
But the true environmental destroyer was their architecture.
The gleaming white cities?
Exactly. The Mayans coated their immense pyramids, their temples, and their sprawling plazas with a brilliant, durable limestone stucco.
It was a massive display of wealth and power.
But the chemical process of creating that stucco requires burning crushed limestone at extremely high temperatures for an extended period of time.
Let's look at the math on that. To produce just 1 single ton of limestone plaster, the Mayan engineers had to burn roughly 20 tons of green wood.
Now multiply that by hundreds of massive temples and sprawling city squares across dozens of expanding megacities.
They were effectively clear-cutting their own environment to build monuments to their own glory.
They were burning their defensive perimeter to the ground.
And when you strip a tropical rainforest of its canopy, you trigger a catastrophic cascade of environmental failures. Without the complex root systems of the ancient trees holding the earth together, the seasonal rains just wash the thin topsoil away.
You get massive erosion. The nutrients are stripped from the land.
But it gets so much worse, because by destroying the trees, they actually altered the local climate.
This is the phenomenon of microclimate shift. A dense jungle canopy acts as a massive humidity trap. The trees release water vapor into the air through transpiration, which contributes to local rainfall.
So when the Mayans clear-cut the forests, they increased the surface temperature of the land and drastically reduced the atmospheric humidity.
By destroying the forest, they were literally suppressing their own rainfall.
They engineered an environmental trap. They pushed the local ecosystem right to the absolute breaking point. They removed every single shock absorber the environment possessed.
And all it would take to completely shatter their magnificent civilization was for the seasonal rains to stop.
And then it did.
The climatological evidence for this is irrefutable. Scientists have extracted deep sediment cores from the bottom of regional lakes and analyzed the chemical composition of cave stalagmites.
Which act like incredibly precise rain gauges over centuries, right?
Exactly. And the data reveals a horrifying sequence of events. Between 800 and 1000 AD, the Mayan lowlands were struck by a severe, prolonged, multi-decadal drought.
Friends, imagine a society where the entire economy, the religion, and the political power structure is entirely dependent on a single crop. Maize.
Corn is incredibly thirsty.
Yes. It requires constant, highly predictable rainfall at very specific times in the growing season. When that rain vanishes, not just for a season, but for years on end, your entire economy evaporates.
The Mayans knew water was their bottleneck. They were brilliant hydrologists. They engineered massive, city-sized reservoirs, lining natural depressions in the rock with that same limestone plaster to prevent the water from seeping into the ground.
These reservoirs were designed to catch the seasonal monsoon rains and sustain the population of the city through the dry season.
But a reservoir is only a brilliant piece of engineering if it actually rains.
When the drought set in and refused to lift, those massive plastered reservoirs became nothing more than empty, baking stone bowls.
The cascading failure of the Mayan society is a masterclass in systemic collapse. Because the entire region relied so heavily on the exact same crop, a localized drought instantly morphed into a regional famine.
You cannot use your vast wealth to trade for food if the neighboring cities' crops are also dead. The intricate, continent-spanning trade networks that supplied these massive cities completely shattered.
And when a crisis of this magnitude hits, you would hope that the brilliant, highly educated leaders of these cities would unite. Did the powerful kings of Tikal, Copan, and Calakmul form a coalition to share resources and engineer a solution?
You hope so, right?
The archaeological and epigraphic records showed the exact opposite. Instead of cooperating to manage the environmental collapse, the Mayan elite turned on each other with brutal ferocity.
They escalated their conflicts. The kings went to war over whatever tiny remaining scraps of fertile land and fresh water existed.
They poured the last reserves of their human labor and their dwindling resources into slaughtering their neighbors instead of adapting to the shifting climate.
The violence accelerated the collapse. The final abandonment of these magnificent cities is one of the most haunting narratives in human history.
It wasn't a sudden cinematic apocalypse. It wasn't a massive volcanic eruption that buried them in a day.
No, it was a slow, agonizing process of starvation, political fragmentation, and societal decay. You can literally see it in the archaeology. Massive temple construction projects simply stop mid-sentence.
Intricate stone carvings are left half-finished. Tools were dropped on the ground.
The population realized that the system was broken beyond repair. People packed whatever they could carry and literally walked away from the gleaming clauses.
They dispersed deep into the remaining jungle in small, fragmented groups, desperately searching for functional water sources.
So they weren't ignorant. They knew how to farm. They just pushed the environment past the breaking point, and nature pushed back.
And the jungle, which the Mayans had fought so aggressively to push back for centuries, slowly, methodically reclaimed the cities.
Massive tree roots tore through the stone plazas. Thick vines swallowed the pyramids.
It is a stark, physical reminder that nature always wins. They understood architecture, mathematics, and agriculture better than almost anyone on Earth at the time. But they pushed their environment past its carrying capacity, and nature pushed back with an overwhelming absolute force.
So we have walked through the freezing, starving ruins of the Roman Empire. We have traced the horrific biological superhighways of the Black Death. We have stood in the suffocating, fluid-filled trenches of 1918.
And we have watched the magnificent Mayan temples get swallowed whole by the jungle they tried to destroy.
Let's pull all of this together. Whether it's the Romans, the victims of the Black Death, the soldiers of WWI, or the Mayans, the lesson is exactly the same. No matter how advanced our engineering, how complex our politics, or how strong our military, we exist at the absolute mercy of nature.
The connective tissue across centuries, across different continents and different technologies, is the sheer hubris of complex systems. When you remove the margin for error, a microscopic shift can collapse the entire structure.
And that brings us to the chilling reality of our current moment. Friends, look around at the architecture of the modern world.
We are vastly more globally connected than the Silk Road ever was. Pathogens don't need a rat on a slow-moving green ship anymore. They can board a commercial jet and cross the globe in 12 hours.
Our megacities are infinitely more crowded, more resource-dependent, and more fragile than Rome or Tikal.
And we are extracting resources from the earth, altering the atmospheric chemistry, and clear-cutting forests at a speed that the Mayan kings couldn't even comprehend in their most ambitious dreams.
If a slight shift in temperature and a microscopic bug could take down the ancients when they were at the peak of their power, what makes us think, for even a second, that we are uniquely immune to the next perfect storm?
We have built a machine that is 1,000,000 times more complex than the Roman Empire, but it runs on the exact same fragile environmental foundation. The perfect storm isn't a historical anomaly. It is a recurring biological and climatological inevitability.
Friends, that is the thought to keep you up at night. The next time you are checking your phone and you see a tiny headline about a new virus emerging halfway across the globe, or you read a report about unprecedented heat waves altering global crop yields, I want you to remember the Roman legions marching home with a cough.
And remember the empty baking stone reservoirs of the Mayans.
The invisible assassins are incredibly patient. We are all just one slight shift in the wind away from history repeating itself.
Truly just one shift away.
So friends, what do you think? How resilient is our modern empire, really? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden forces that shape our world, be sure to let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Stay infinitely curious, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Friends, I want you to imagine something with me. Like, really put yourself right there in the moment. Picture standing in the dirt and the grit of a cobblestone street in Rome.
Oh, setting the scene. I like it.
Yeah, it's a very specific night, okay? The year is 476 AD. The air is thick, it is unseasonably cold, and the smell of wood smoke is just absolutely everywhere.
And not the cozy kind of wood smoke, right?
Exactly, not a fireplace. If you look out toward the edges of the city, toward the horizon, you see fires burning. But they aren't from hearths or the local blacksmith. They are from the encampments of Germanic tribes.
Right, tens of thousands of warriors.
Yes. Tens of thousands of them have completely methodically encircled what used to be the most impenetrable, invincible walls in the Western world.
It is such a chilling scene to try and mentally place yourself into. I mean, the sensory details of that night alone must have been absolutely overwhelming for the people there.
It had to be terrifying.
Completely. Because, you have to understand the psychological weight of those walls. For centuries, being inside Rome meant you were safe. You were at the center of the universe.
Right.
And now suddenly, the universe is at the gates, and they're holding torches.
The sheer psychological terror of it is wild. Just imagine the sounds, friends. It is not the roaring clash of a Hollywood movie battle.
No, it's much more eerie than that.
It's quieter, which almost makes it worse, right? It's the sudden startle of horses in the distance.
Yeah.
The sharp, unmistakable clashing of metal echoing from miles away across the hills.
The sound of a foreign language being shouted in the dark.
Exactly. And inside the city, the people who used to walk through the Roman Forum with this absolute unshakable pride of being Roman-like, the masters of the known world, are just completely terrified.
They're panicking.
Oh, total panic. They are dragging heavy wooden furniture in front of their doors. They're barricading themselves in.
Lighting tiny flickering candles in the dark.
Yes, clutching their children in sheer terror, whispering prayers to gods that just seem to have completely abandoned them at this point.
And the most striking visual of all of this, the real cinematic focal point of this night, is happening just outside the inner gates.
Yeah.
And it's not a scene of glorious, desperate combat.
No, not at all. There is no heroic last stand. There is just an old man.
An old man in a heavy crimson cloak.
Right, the last Western Roman emperor, or, at least the people of that time still called the emperor. And he is just standing there in the cold, watching.
He's just watching it happen.
He is watching the shadows of Germanic warriors casually breach the city gates. I mean, they are walking in completely unchallenged.
The guards are gone.
Gone, surrendered, or they just don't care anymore. No grand battle, just an old man in red watching the Western Roman Empire just end.
It's wild. An empire that once stretched from the freezing mists of Scotland all the way down to the scorching sands of the Sahara.
From the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River.
And it just evaporates. It ended in the exact way the people of that era understood it. The lights simply went out on an institution that had defined the known world for centuries.
It's just gone.
Yeah, the political structure, the military dominance, the cultural hegemony, it all just vanished into the night air.
But friends, here's where we have to stop and unpack this. Because the real question we're jumping into in this deep dive isn't about the date. It isn't about when the Western Roman Empire ended.
Right, the date is just a marker.
Exactly. The real question, the absolute mystery of it all that has plagued historians for over 1,000 years, is why did it have to end like this?
Why a whimper instead of a bang?
Yes, because if we rewind the clock just 400 years from that night, back to the era of Emperor Trajan around 117 AD, Rome was at its absolute peak.
It was untouchable.
It wasn't just big, it was the greatest, most complex empire in recorded human history up to that point. So, what happened?
And it wasn't just about military might either. Though they certainly had, the formidable, disciplined military machine on the planet.
Oh, for sure. The legions were legendary.
But it was about infrastructure. It was about engineering. The Romans had engineers who could casually throw massive stone bridges across vast, raging rivers in a matter of weeks.
It's incredible.
They built aqueducts that spanned entire valleys, precisely angled to carry fresh water dozens of miles into the heart of cities.
Right, the plumbing alone.
Yeah. And they possessed a legal framework, a system of contracts and property rights, so incredibly complex and robust that it literally serves as the bedrock for modern legal systems today.
And a bureaucracy. A sprawling, functioning bureaucracy that somehow managed to take tens of millions of people from wildly different cultures, religions, and languages and weave them together under one single flag.
Which is mind-blowing for the ancient world.
Seriously. I mean, they were collecting taxes in Egypt, using it to buy grain, shipping that grain across the Mediterranean, and using it to feed citizens in Italy.
The logistics of that are just staggering.
So, friends, What in the world happened in those 400 years? How do you go from engineering marvels and global dominance to an old man watching barbarians literally just walk through the front door?
Well, that is the core map of our deep dive today. We are looking at the mechanics of failure.
The blueprints of collapse.
Exactly. And what's truly fascinating here, the reason we're spending the next hour looking at this, is that this isn't just a story about Rome.
Right. It's so much bigger than that.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are looking at a universal pattern. We're looking at the blueprint of why complex societies crumble from the inside out.
Because this creeping decay, this slow, agonizing unwinding of a massive system, it happened to the Maya civilization, eventually swallowed up by the dense jungles of Central America.
It happened on Easter Island.
Yes, a tiny speck of land in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. It even happened in our modern era, friends, with the rapid, almost entirely warless dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991.
So we are going to extract the recurring DNA of these collapses. We aren't just looking for a list of historical dates. We are looking for the shared symptoms, the underlying math and ecology that catch up to every great civilization.
So as we go through this, I want you to mentally put yourself in the shoes of a leader. Imagine you are the CEO, the emperor, the king, the president.
You're the one in charge.
You are managing a massive, sprawling, highly complex system. What happens when the very things that made your society great in the first place, your aggressive expansion, your towering ambition, become the heavy iron anchors that drag the whole ship down?
It's a terrifying thought experiment.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's start with the very first major pattern that practically screams at us from the source material, the curse of overexpansion.
Basically getting way too big to govern.
Exactly. Let's go back to Rome at its absolute height under Emperor Trajan. Paint a picture for us of the sheer scale we are talking about here.
Okay, so at that point in 117 AD, the scale of the empire is actually difficult to comprehend without, pulling up a modern map.
Right.
We are talking about controlling roughly 5 million square kilometers of territory.
5 million.
Yeah. To put that in perspective, that is the entirety of modern-day Western Europe, a massive chunk of Eastern Europe, the entire coast of North Africa, Egypt, the Levant, all the way into modern-day Iraq.
That is just mind-boggling.
It is, and a population estimated to be between 50 and 60 million people.
Wow.
But here is the critical part to understand, friends. They are managing this without the internet.
No fiber optics.
No telegraphs, no motorized transport, no airplanes. The speed of communication was literally limited to the speed of a horse running along a dirt or stone road, or a wooden ship relying on the wind.
So how did they actually do it? Because just saying they had a big empire doesn't really explain the day-to-day reality of running the thing.
Well, they had to build an unbelievable continent-spanning bureaucracy. They created something called the cursus publicus.
The cursus publicus. Got it.
Yeah, it was the state-run courier and transportation service. It was a massive network of relay stations located at regular intervals along thousands of miles of Roman roads.
Like a Pony Express kind of deal.
Exactly like that. A courier could ride a horse to exhaustion, swap it for a fresh one at the station, and just keep going.
Okay, that's pretty smart.
It was. But even with that marvel of ancient logistics, it would still take weeks for a message from the emperor in Rome to reach a general stationed on Hadrian's Wall in Britain.
Weeks just to say, hey, we need backup. And it wasn't just messages, right? It was physical stuff. They had to maintain a massive standing military to guard those borders.
Hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
And soldiers need to eat, they need armor, they need to be paid in actual coin.
Right. You have legions stationed along thousands of miles of incredibly hostile borders. You have an endless flow of resources that has to move from the productive centers to the edges, and taxes moving from the edges back to the center.
It sounds exhausting just thinking about it.
You have to pay governors, scribes, tax collectors, road builders. The energetic cost of just keeping the lights on across 5 million square kilometers is staggering.
It's a logistical miracle that it worked at all. But then we fast forward to the 3rd century, and the bill finally comes due.
It always does.
The sources describe this period as the crisis of the 3rd century, and friends, it sounds like an absolute nightmare. Rome gets hit with simultaneous overlapping crises.
The worst case scenario.
They've got multiple Germanic tribes invading the northern borders all at once. They have a massive, newly energized Persian Empire attacking from the east.
And internal rebellions are popping up like wildfire because local generals realize Rome is simply too far away to stop them.
The cat's away, the mice will play.
Exactly. And this leads to a crazy, rapid turnover of emperors. The military realizes they are the true power brokers now.
Right.
So a legion in Gaul declares their general the emperor. A legion in Syria declares their general the emperor. They march on each other, kill each other off, and it seemed like a new guy was taking the throne every few months.
So put us in the room with the people trying to manage this chaos. What happens to the actual mechanics of the state when a system is under that much stress from every possible direction?
The costs just skyrocket. Every time there is an invasion, you need to raise a new army.
Which costs money.
Every time there's a civil war, the fields are burned, meaning tax revenue plummets exactly when you need it most.
It's like getting a massive hospital bill the exact same day you lose your job.
That is a perfect way to look at it. The sheer financial and energetic burden of trying to put out literal and figurative fires across 5 million square kilometers becomes mathematically unsustainable.
The bandwidth is just gone.
The administrative bandwidth of the central government in Rome is completely overwhelmed. They cannot physically react fast enough to crises happening simultaneously in Britain and Syria.
Which leads to a fascinating moment in the sources. Emperor Diocletian eventually steps in around 284 AD.
A very important figure.
He looks at this burning house and tries to perform emergency open-heart surgery on the entire empire. He decides the only way to fix a system that is fundamentally too big to govern is to just chop it into pieces.
It was a radical but highly logical move. Diocletian realizes the bottleneck is the emperor himself.
Because one guy can't be everywhere.
Exactly.
Right.
One man cannot be on the Rhine fighting Germans and on the Euphrates fighting Persians at the exact same time. So he split the empire into 4 distinct administrative zones.
The tetrarchy.
Yes, the tetrarchy. 2 senior emperors, 2 junior emperors.
He essentially franchises the Roman Empire, friends. Like a fast food chain.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it's a great analogy. It was a desperate attempt to shorten the distance between a problem and the person authorized to solve it.
To fix the lag.
Right. By having an emperor permanently stationed in the east and one in the west, they could react to border incursions without waiting months for permission from a central capital.
But even though it worked for a little while, Diocletian's split is a classic glaring symptom of this first pattern we are looking at.
The curse of size.
Expanding beyond the limits of governance creates a situation where the sheer maintenance costs eat you alive. It makes me think of a very modern, everyday analogy.
Oh, let's hear it.
Think of a wildly successful tech startup. Let's say a couple of founders create a brilliant piece of software, right? They start in one city, maybe in a small office.
Very agile.
Everything is super agile. They can make million-dollar decisions over lunch. They are lean, they are fast, and they are basically printing money.
The expansion phase always feels like pure victory. The revenue graph is just going up and to the right.
Exactly. So the board says, let's go global. They decide to expand into 30 different countries all at once. Suddenly, they have to open physical offices in Berlin, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, London.
And that's when the hidden costs of complexity reveal themselves.
Yes, because suddenly reality sets in. They have to hire localized HR teams in every single country.
Oh, the paperwork.
They have to hire lawyers to navigate 30 different sets of international labor laws and tax compliance codes. They need to hire layers upon layers of middle management just to communicate between the different time zones.
Cultural barriers, translation services, yeah.
And within a year, the logistics and the administrative overhead are completely eating all the profits.
The core product might still be absolutely great, right?
People still want to buy the software, but the sheer weight of the company's size is crushing its ability to function.
That is a perfect parallel, because these empires, whether it's Rome in the 3rd century or a massive corporate entity today, they rarely fall overnight.
It's a slow burn.
The overexpansion creates this creeping systemic fragility. A startup might easily survive a bad quarter or a minor product flaw when it's small, lean, and agile.
Right, you just pivot.
But when it becomes a bloated, heavily leveraged global behemoth, a minor supply chain hiccup or a single localized lawsuit can trigger a cascading failure that brings down the entire corporate structure.
It's so true. And friends, we see this exact same logistical nightmare, the ping time problem with the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th century.
Oh, absolutely. The Mongols are the ultimate test case for the limits of geography.
They conquered everything.
Genghis Khan and his descendants pulled off the most rapid, vast military conquest in human history. We are talking about territory stretching from the eastern coast of China, across the Asian steppes, through the Middle East, all the way into Eastern Europe.
But just like Rome, the sheer geography became their biggest enemy.
They actually had a communication system remarkably similar to the Roman postal service, called the YAM system.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was a network of relay stations with fresh horses that allowed messages to travel up to 200 miles a day.
That's incredibly fast for the Middle Ages.
It was. But the Mongol Empire was so unfathomably huge that even at 200 miles a day, the distances were simply too great.
Right. Our sources point out that when the Great Khan died in the capital of Karakoram, the Mongol armies that were actively invading Europe had to turn around and march all the way back to Mongolia to elect a new leader.
Imagine that. You're winning a war and you have to walk home for an election.
The entire momentum of the empire was halted by the necessity of physical travel.
And when the Mongol Empire eventually divided into 4 separate khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty, the physical distance between them caused fatal political and cultural fractures.
You just can't dynamically govern a unified, cohesive state when a crisis breaks out in Persia, and it takes 2 months for the rider to reach China.
Another month for the administration to debate a response.
And then 6 months to march an army back to Persia. Like you perfectly phrased it earlier, you cannot survive when your ping time is measured in seasons.
Ping time measured in seasons. It really is the ultimate bandwidth limit.
It is. And the Mongols aren't alone here. We don't even have to look that far back into history, friends. Look at the British Empire, the famous empire on which the sun never set.
Right, a much more modern example, obviously dealing with telegraphs and steamships, but the exact same fundamental mechanics of overextension are at play.
At its peak, Britain held massive colonies across the globe. India, large swaths of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, the Caribbean.
But post-World War II, Britain was fundamentally economically exhausted.
The war had completely drained their treasury.
And when you are economically drained, the brutal math of empire becomes very, very clear.
The sheer resource drain of trying to physically hold, police, and administer colonies thousands of miles away became mathematically impossible.
They had to maintain civil services, militaries, and infrastructure in India, while their own cities in England were still rebuilding from bomb damage.
It doesn't make sense. The cost of maintaining the imperial structure finally exceeded the economic value they were extracting from it.
They weren't conquered by a foreign army in those colonies.
No. They were forced into a massive, rapid contraction because they simply couldn't afford the maintenance bill anymore.
Which brings us to the inevitable second act of this systemic fragility. When a society overexpands, you don't just run out of administrative bandwidth or communication speed.
You eventually run out of actual, literal resources.
The system demands more energy than the environment can provide.
And this brings us to the next massive pattern: running out of money before you run out of problems.
Classic trap.
And friends, this is where it gets incredibly fascinating, because we're going to look at what physically happens when the economic engine of a superpower stalls out. How does a society try to cheat math?
Let's go back to Rome for this, specifically looking at the economic consequences of all those 3rd century crises we just talked about.
The invasions and civil wars.
Right. To pay for this massive continent-spanning army, which they desperately needed to stop the invasions, and to pay for the bloated bureaucracy required to manage it, the Roman state needed money.
Cold, hard cash.
A vast, constant flow of gold and silver.
But they couldn't just magically generate more gold and silver, right? They didn't have fiat currency. Their money was backed by the physical scarcity of the metal.
Exactly. So put yourself in the shoes of a desperate Roman emperor. The soldiers on the frontier haven't been paid in 3 months.
They are angry.
They are threatening to mutiny and march on Rome. You look in the imperial treasury, and the vaults are nearly empty.
Panic mode.
You cannot raise taxes enough to cover the shortfall, because the economy is already battered by war. So what do? You resort to debasement.
Okay, let's break down the physical mechanics of debasement for everyone listening, because it is essentially the ancient equivalent of printing money out of thin air.
Right, here is how it physically worked in the imperial mints. The Roman standard silver coin was the denarius.
The denarius.
Originally, under Augustus, it was almost pure silver. But a desperate emperor would order the mints to melt down the existing silver coins coming from taxes.
Okay.
They would take that pure silver and mix in cheaper base metals, primarily copper or bronze.
They would literally water down the metal, like watering down a drink at a cheap bar.
Exactly. Then they would strike new coins using this diluted alloy. The new coins had the exact same face value stamped on them.
Yeah.
They were still officially called a denarius, but they contained far less actual precious metal.
Sneaky.
By doing this, The emperor could take 1,000 pure silver coins and magically turn them into 2,000 diluted silver coins.
Boom. Suddenly, he has enough money to pay the mutinous soldiers. It sounds like a brilliant, easy fix.
But the Roman citizens weren't stupid.
No. They handled these coins every single day.
They noticed almost immediately. The new coins felt different. They weighed slightly less. They didn't have the same bright silver shine. They looked duller, sometimes almost brown from the copper content.
When a merchant bit the coin, it felt different.
And what is the immediate logical result of that?
Rampant, crippling hyperinflation. The merchants realized the physical money they were being handed was intrinsically worth less. So if a loaf of bread used to cost 1 silver denarius, the baker now says, these new coins are mostly copper. I need 5 of these new coins for the same loaf of bread.
This creates a devastating, inescapable economic spiral. The state debases the currency to pay its bills. The merchants raise prices to compensate.
The soldiers realize their pay doesn't buy as much food, so they demand higher pay.
The state, lacking funds, debases the currency even further to meet the new demands. Over the course of the 3rd century, the silver content of the denarius plummeted from nearly 100% down to barely 2%.
2%. It was effectively a copper coin lightly washed in silver.
A total sham.
The citizens lost total, absolute faith in the money, and when people don't trust the currency, trade just grinds to a halt.
Why sell your valuable wheat or your handcrafted shoes for worthless pieces of copper?
Exactly. People reverted to bartering. The entire incredibly complex Roman economy essentially stagnated. And this is where Emperor Diocletian steps in again in the year 301 AD, with a famous piece of legislation called the Edict on Maximum Prices.
It is one of the most revealing documents in economic history.
It really is.
Because it shows a profound failure of the leadership to understand the root cause of their own crisis.
I find this so incredibly frustrating and fascinating at the same time. Instead of looking in the mirror and saying, hey, we are causing this inflation by watering down the money to pay our massive military bills, maybe we need to restructure our expenses, Diocletian basically tries to make the laws of economics illegal.
He issues a massive detailed decree setting a hard, uncompromising cap on what merchants could charge for thousands of individual items.
He made a massive list.
He set a maximum price for a pound of beef, a pair of sandals, a day's wages for a carpenter, a measure of grain.
And the penalty for charging more than the maximum price was, in many cases, death.
Death for overcharging for sandals.
But you cannot legislate away the mathematical reality of resource depletion, friends. If a shoemaker knows it costs him more to buy the leather than the government allows him to sell the shoes for, what does he do?
He stops making shoes.
Or, more accurately, he stops selling them in the open market.
Exactly. The edict, predictably, was a massive, catastrophic failure. Goods instantly vanished from the public markets.
The black market just exploded.
People hoarded whatever valuable goods they had, and the economic stagnation worsened drastically. The state tried to cure a symptom with an axe while completely ignoring the underlying disease.
So in the case of Rome, the currency they ran out of was literal money precious metals. But our sources highlight a vital concept here.
Yes, the definition of currency.
Right. Money or currency can mean very different things to different civilizations. A currency is just the foundational resource that allows a society to function.
Let's travel across the world for a great example of this. Away from the marble columns of Rome into the dense, humid jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula.
The Maya civilization.
The Maya are a brilliant, incredibly complex society. We are talking about a civilization that developed a fully phonetic writing system.
Incredibly precise astronomical calendars.
And monumental architecture. But between roughly 800 and 1000 AD, the Maya experienced what archaeologists call the classic Maya collapse.
And the primary trigger was a severe, prolonged period of drought.
No, wait a minute. A drought is weather. It's terrible, sure. But societies survive bad weather all the time.
Right, they do. But the sources point out that this wasn't just a weather event. The drought was a crisis that struck a system that was already suffering from profound, self-inflicted creeping fragility.
What's fascinating here is how the Maya built their society in the first place. To support massive, bustling metropolis cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Copan cities, with tens of thousands of inhabitants, they relied on intensive agriculture.
They needed to feed huge populations in a tropical forest environment, which, ironically, isn't naturally suited for massive, concentrated crop yields.
Tropical soil is actually notoriously thin and poor in nutrients once you clear the canopy.
So to feed all those people, they had to heavily manipulate their environment, they had to drain swamps, build raised fields, and, most importantly, clear vast tracts of forest to plant more maize.
And it wasn't just for farming, right? The Maya had a cultural obsession with monumental architecture.
They built those towering, iconic step pyramids.
But to cover those pyramids in the smooth, gleaming white stucco that they loved, they had to burn limestone.
And the chemical process of burning limestone to create plaster requires an obscene amount of fuel. The ratio is something like 20 tons of green wood to produce just 1 ton of plaster.
20 to 1. They were clear-cutting their own environment at an industrial scale to fuel both their agriculture and their monumental vanity projects.
And here is where the ecology bites back, friends. When you aggressively deforest a tropical environment, you drastically alter the microclimate.
Trees hold moisture in the soil.
And they transpire water back into the atmosphere, which creates rain. Remove the trees, and the local temperature rises while rainfall decreases.
Furthermore, the exposed, thin tropical soil rapidly erodes away.
So, when this massive multi-decade severe drought finally hit between 800 and 1000 AD, it wasn't just bad luck.
It struck an ecological system that was already pushed to its absolute breaking point.
The currency the Maya ran out of wasn't silver coins, it was arable land and fresh water.
Their complex cities, which required massive energy inputs just to maintain daily life, simply couldn't generate enough calories to sustain their populations.
It led to starvation, warfare over dwindling resources, and eventually the rapid abandonment of the major southern cities.
The jungle grew back over the pyramids because the ecological currency was bankrupt.
Which brings us to perhaps the most visually striking, tragic example of a society running out of a vital currency. It is a microcosm of this entire pattern, isolated in the middle of the ocean.
Easter Island.
Rapa Nui.
Yes. Polynesian settlers arrived on this incredibly remote island sometime around 1200 AD. And it's crucial to understand what the island looked like when they first beached their canoes.
It wasn't the barren, grassy landscape we see today, right?
Not at all. It was a lush, heavily forested environment covered in massive palm trees.
But the Easter Islanders, over the centuries, developed a deep, almost obsessive cultural and religious focus on constructing and moving these massive stone statues.
The moai.
Yes, the moai. These are those iconic giant stone heads and torsos that line the coast.
The creation of the moai was the central organizing principle of their entire society. The rival clans competed for prestige by building bigger and bigger statues.
But to carve these colossal stones out of the volcanic quarry, and more importantly, to move them miles across the island to the coastlines, they needed timber.
Lots and lots of timber.
Because you can't just drag a multi-ton stone across the dirt. You need heavy logs to use as rollers. You need strong timber to build levering structures.
You need the bark from specific trees to weave the massive, thick ropes required to haul them.
Precisely. The timber was their foundational currency. It was the physical resource that allowed their complex cultural expressions to exist.
Okay, hold on. Let's look at this rationally for a second.
Yeah,
Are you telling me that the leaders of Easter Island essentially looked at their diminishing forests, looked at the giant stone statues, and decided to spend all their money, in this case, cutting down their literal last trees just to move more rocks?
it's hard to believe, right?
How does a society not hit the brakes?
It seems completely irrational from the outside, but within their cultural framework, building the statues was how you ensured the favor of the gods, the fertility of the land, and the political legitimacy of the chiefs.
So it wasn't just art to them.
No. The leaders of the society prioritized the maintenance of their cultural grandeur, the immediate political prestige of erecting another moai over the long-term ecological sustainability of their environment.
They doubled down on the very behavior that was destroying them.
And the consequences were absolutely brutal. Once the trees were gone, the entire interconnected ecological web collapsed.
Devastatingly so. Deforestation led to massive soil erosion, just like with the Maya, which crushed their agricultural output.
The winds off the ocean battered their crops without the protective forest canopy.
But even worse, without the large palm trees, they could no longer build the large, sturdy canoes necessary to venture out into the deeper ocean, to hunt dolphins and large fish.
Oh, wow, so they instantly lost their primary source of protein.
Yes. They were trapped on a barren island, unable to fish, unable to farm effectively, surrounded by giant stone statues staring blankly out at the ocean.
That is just haunting.
The entire ecological foundation of their society collapsed, leading to violent tribal warfare over the remaining scraps of food and a catastrophic population crash.
So whether the currency is debased silver coins in a Roman market, arable soil in the Yucatan jungle, or vital timber on a remote Pacific island, The pattern is eerily identical.
It is a terrifying thought, because what it shows us is that leaders faced with a creeping crisis often choose to aggressively maintain the grandeur and the status quo of the old system.
They would rather build another statue or mint another fake coin than make the incredibly painful, unpopular choice to scale back and restructure.
And by doing so, they just hit the accelerator on the crash.
Which naturally raises an incredibly important question about the psychology of power. Why do leaders make these seemingly irrational choices?
Why double down on the statues when you're clearly running out of trees? Why not change course?
Well, friends, that takes us directly into the next massive concept in our sources. This is a framework introduced by the complex systems scientist Peter Turchin, and I have to admit, this completely blew my mind when I read it.
It is the concept of elite overproduction and internal wars.
Turchin's framework is absolutely vital for understanding why societies collapse from the inside, often before any external threat even arrives.
He approaches history not just as a series of events, but as a system of mathematical equations governing social dynamics. And he coined the term elite overproduction.
So let's break down what this actually means in practice. Basically, elite overproduction happens when a society is successful for a long period of time.
Success breeds wealth.
And that wealth allows more and more families to educate their children, accumulate resources, and enter the elite class. But there's a mathematical trap here, friends.
The society is producing far more people who are educated, wealthy, and fiercely vying for top-tier positions of power than there are actual positions available for them to occupy.
It is a massive bottleneck of ambition. The supply of aspiring elites vastly outstrips the demand for leadership roles.
Let's look at a concrete historical example to make this real. The late Roman Republic.
This is the period before Rome became an empire ruled by one man.
Back when it was still a republic, the path to power, the cursus honorum, was fiercely competitive. You had the old nobility, the established patrician families who had been senators for generations.
The old money.
Right. But because Rome was expanding and conquering so much territory, you suddenly had all these new men, the newly rich merchants, military contractors, and provincial landowners who had made massive fortunes.
The new money. So now you have a dramatically expanded pool of highly ambitious, highly resourced individuals.
They all have money, they all have elite educations, and they all believe they deserve to rule.
But they're looking at a political system that is mathematically rigid. There are still only so many governorships available in the provinces.
There are only so many military commands.
There are only so many seats in the Senate, and crucially, only 2 consulships available every single year.
The chairs are limited, but the number of people playing musical chairs has quintupled. And what happens?
The competition for these posts became absolutely vicious. It went from polite political maneuvering in the Senate to bribery, to street gangs fighting in the Roman Forum, and eventually to literal warfare.
We're talking about the massive civil wars that ripped the Republic apart. Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon to fight Pompey, Augustus fighting Mark Antony.
And this is the crucial distinction to make, friends. These civil wars weren't rebellions of the poor, starving masses rising up against their oppressors.
No, these were wars ignited, funded, and fought by the absolute top 1% of society.
It was the elites fighting each other over a limited pie of power, and they were willing to burn the Republic to the ground if it meant they got to be the ones standing on the ashes.
And we see a strikingly similar dynamic playing out through a totally different mechanism, much later in history within the Ottoman Empire, during the 16th and 17th centuries.
The sources point us specifically to the Devshirme system.
Yes. The Devshirme was a fascinating, highly complex social institution. As the Ottoman Empire expanded into the Balkans and Eastern Europe, they implemented a system where they would conscript young Christian boys from their conquered territories.
They would take them away from their families, convert them to Islam, and bring them into the heart of the empire.
Which sounds brutal to our modern ears.
It really does. But within the context of the empire, they were given the absolute highest levels of education available.
They were trained in mathematics, theology, administration, and advanced military tactics. They were actively grooming them to be the elite backbone of the state.
The strongest and most militarily gifted became the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps.
The brightest and most intellectually gifted were sent to the palace school to become the top bureaucrats, governors, and viziers of the empire.
Initially, this was a massive, brilliant strength for the Ottomans. It created a fiercely loyal, highly competent meritocracy.
Because these men had no ties to the old, entrenched aristocratic families, their loyalty was entirely to the sultan who elevated them.
It drove Ottoman expansion and efficiency for generations. But over time, the system became a victim of its own success.
Exactly. The imperial machine kept running. The schools kept churning out cohort after cohort of these highly qualified, fiercely ambitious young men.
But as the empire stopped expanding as rapidly, the number of high-ranking roles, the lucrative governorships, the positions as vizier remained relatively static.
Right. The system produced too many highly qualified candidates. The bottleneck.
And what happened? The result was intense, paralyzing infighting within the administration.
Corruption spiked massively as desperate graduates tried to bribe their way into roles they felt they deserved.
Factions formed, constantly plotting against each other, leading to the systemic weakening and stagnation of the state.
Okay, wait. Let's pause here. Because I think a lot of people listening might be genuinely confused by this concept.
It feels counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah. Shouldn't having more highly educated, highly capable, incredibly elite people be a good thing for a society? Doesn't a massive, deep talent pool of smart people make a country stronger and more innovative?
It is a very logical assumption to make. We are taught that education and capability are always net positives. But here is the profound aha insight of Turchin's theory, friends. It is not about the talent itself.
The talent is great.
It is about the math of human ambition and expectation.
The expectation. Explain that a bit more.
When you have highly capable, wealthy, and networked people who have been told their whole lives that they are the elite, they expect a commensurate level of status, power, and reward.
Right.
When the physical structure of the society denies them that power because there simply aren't enough chairs when the music stops, they do not just quietly go home and accept a mediocre life.
Oh, wow. They don't just give up.
No. They use their resources to actively fight the system itself.
Exactly. Frustrated ambition is a highly destructive force. When a highly educated, wealthy person is blocked from traditional paths to power, they weaponize their wealth, their education, and their networks against the establishment.
They become what Turchin calls counter-elites.
They start funding rival political factions, they start running smear campaigns.
And most dangerously, they look for marginalized groups or angry lower classes and exploit their genuine grievances, harnessing that populist anger to propel themselves into power and destabilize the entire state.
That internal conflict, driven by frustrated elites, is often far more devastating to a society than any foreign army could ever be.
That is deeply unsettling when you look at the modern world. So if we look at our scorecard so far, we've got logistical overexpansion completely draining the treasury.
Sure.
We have societies running out of physical resources and ruining their own ecology to build monuments.
Check.
And we have highly educated, wealthy elites actively tearing the house down from the inside out because they are fighting over who gets the master bedroom.
It's quite a toxic cocktail. It is the perfect recipe for internal fragility.
But so far, we have looked mostly at the internal machinery of the state and the choices made by its people. What happens when the physical, external world around that state fundamentally starts to change?
And that, friends, brings us to the work of the famous historian and geographer Jared Diamond.
His framework adds a completely crucial layer to our understanding of collapse because he focuses heavily on the interaction between the environment, external shocks, and, frankly, the sheer power of human stubbornness.
Jared Diamond, in his seminal book Collapse, outlines a very specific, interlocking 5-factor framework to try and explain why some societies fail while others survive.
He argues that it's rarely just one thing, but a combination of pressures. Let's run through his factors. Factor number 1, human-caused environmental damage.
We already saw that vividly with the Maya clear-cutting their forests for plaster and the Easter Islanders cutting down their trees for statues. They actively destroyed the foundation of their own survival.
Factor number 2, climate change. And Diamond means this broadly. Whether it's a natural shift in global temperatures or human-driven climate change, the environment stops behaving the way the society expects it to.
Factor number 3, hostile neighbors pressing in on the borders, like Rome dealing with the Germanic tribes.
Factor number 4, the loss of essential trade partners, which can suddenly cut off a vital resource a society depends on.
Those first 4 factors are the pressures. They are the problems that the universe throws at a society. But it's the 5th factor that is the absolute linchpin of Diamond's entire theory.
Factor 5, how a society chooses to respond to the first 4 problems.
Exactly. Diamond argues quite forcefully that environmental shifts, droughts, or hostile neighbors very rarely destroy a complex society entirely on their own.
Instead, societies effectively choose to fail or they choose to succeed based entirely on their cultural willingness to adapt to the new reality.
And the sources provide us with the perfect, most frustrating, head-scratching historical example of this dynamic in action: the Norse settlement in Greenland.
Oh, this story is wild. The Greenland Norse are an incredible case study in the lethal danger of cultural stubbornness. They were Vikings, essentially.
They arrived in Greenland around 985 AD, led by Eric the Red. And it's important to note that when they arrived, they were in the middle of a global climate anomaly known as the medieval warm period.
Right. The climate was relatively mild. I mean, it wasn't a tropical paradise, obviously, it's Greenland, but the fjords were free of ice in the summer, and the meadows had enough grass to actually be green.
And they didn't just visit, they settled. They built a society there that survived for a remarkably long time, 500 years.
That's longer than the United States has existed?
They were incredibly resilient.
Huh.
But the way they survived is the key. They survived by stubbornly transplanting their exact Northern European lifestyle directly onto this new marginal landmass.
They considered themselves European farmers. They built traditional stone churches. They imported the latest European fashion trends via rare trading ships. And crucially, their entire economy and diet were based on raising cows and sheep.
Which, again, was manageable while the climate was warm. They could grow enough hay in the short summer to keep the cows alive inside dark barns during the winter.
But then the environment shifted. The medieval warm period ended, and a period known as the Little Ice Age began. Global temperatures plummeted.
The sea ice expanded, cutting off trade ships from Europe. The summers got shorter. The growing seasons shrank.
Suddenly, raising cows and sheep in a freezing marginal climate became an agonizing, almost impossible struggle. The livestock started starving, and consequently, the Norse started starving.
And this is where Diamond's fifth factor of the society's response comes to the forefront, because they weren't the only humans living in Greenland.
They shared the territory with the Inuit people.
The Inuit, who had been living in incredibly harsh Arctic conditions for thousands of years, they were the masters of that environment.
They had highly developed, specialized techniques for survival. They built kayaks to hunt seals and whales in the open ocean. They knew how to build snow structures to stay warm.
They wore incredibly effective clothing made from animal skins and furs designed to trap body heat. The Inuit were perfectly, elegantly adapted to the cooling climate. They thrived in it.
But the Norse stubbornly, resolutely clung to their European identity. The archaeological record is staggering.
There is almost zero evidence that the Norse ever adopted Inuit hunting techniques.
They refused to wear Inuit-style clothing, preferring their woven wool garments, which were inferior in the freezing wet.
And, incredibly, bone isotope analysis shows they largely refused to eat fish or marine mammals, viewing it as a lower-class food, or perhaps culturally taboo.
They wanted to eat beef and mutton. They continued trying to be European dairy farmers on an island that was rapidly turning into an ice cube.
It is wild to think about. I was trying to think of a good analogy for this. It's not just like refusing a software update. It is much deeper than that.
It's like a wildly successful CEO whose legacy business is suddenly failing because the market changed. The company is bleeding cash, but the CEO refuses to fly commercial or sell the company's private jet.
Because to them, being a successful CEO fundamentally means having a private jet.
Exactly. They would literally rather bankrupt the entire company and lose everything than give up the symbol of their identity.
That is a remarkably accurate psychological analogy. What we are looking at in Greenland is the psychology of cultural identity acting as a fatal blinder.
For the Norse, being a civilized, successful human being meant being a Christian, European pastoral farmer.
To abandon farming, to put on sealskins, and start hunting whales like the Inuit wasn't just a dietary or economic shift. To them, it felt like a total loss of their core identity.
It felt like a descent into savagery. It meant losing what made them...
So they literally chose to starve to death in their stone houses, holding on to their shivering sheep, rather than adapt, eat fish, and survive.
It proves Diamond's point beautifully and tragically. The environmental shift, the Little Ice Age, was a severe, terrible challenge, but it was only deadly because the Norse society, structurally and culturally, refused to pivot.
The Inuit survived the exact same climate shift in the exact same location, facing the exact same weather, because their culture was built for adaptation.
The Norse, blinded by their identity, effectively chose to fail.
Okay, friends, let's take a deep breath. We have covered a lot of ground.
We really have. We've looked at the stubbornness of identity, the greed of elites, the math of logistics. Now, I want to introduce a completely different lens.
This is perhaps the most paradigm-shifting idea in all of our sources.
We are diving into the theories of the anthropologist Joseph Tainter and what he calls the complexity trap.
If Jared Diamond looks at human choice, morality, and the environment, Joseph Tainter looks at the cold, hard, amoral mathematics of social organization.
His 1988 book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, completely revolutionized how historians and archaeologists view this topic. He strips away the drama and looks at the mechanics.
Tainter starts with a really foundational, simple idea. Societies are, at their very core, problem-solving organizations. That is why we form them.
Think about it from the ground up, starting from a hunter-gatherer tribe. When humans gather together and face a problem like needing to secure a stable food supply or needing to defend themselves against a rival tribe, how do we solve it?
We add a layer of complexity.
Exactly. We don't solve problems by becoming simpler. We invent agriculture. That's a massive leap in complexity.
Then, to manage the grain, we create a dedicated class of administrators. We invent writing specifically to keep track of taxes and grain stores.
We build a professional military. We engineer irrigation canals to manage the water supply. Every single time we face a hurdle, our default societal response is to build a new institution, a new technology, or a new layer of bureaucracy to jump over it.
And Tainter points out that initially, this works brilliantly. It is highly rational. The return on investment, the ROI, of early complexity is massive.
When a relatively simple farming village first pools their labor to build a basic irrigation canal, the amount of extra food they get from that canal vastly outweighs the physical effort it took to dig the ditch.
The society thrives, the population booms, and everyone is better off. The complexity pays for itself 100 times over.
But here is where the trap slowly snaps shut, friends. Over time, as a society grows older and larger, we hit a mathematical wall. Tainter calls it the law of diminishing returns on complexity.
Because the easy problems get solved first. The cheap, high ROI solutions are already implemented. The low-hanging fruit is gone.
So when new problems arise, say, a massive, unprecedented drought, or an increasingly sophisticated, heavily armed enemy appearing on your border, solving those new problems requires exponentially more energy, more resources, and more bureaucracy than the old problems did.
You can't just dig a simple ditch anymore. You have to build massive stone aqueducts from sources 50 miles away.
You can't just arm farmers with spears. You have to train elite, professional soldiers, pay them a salary, and equip them with expensive iron armor.
You have to hire auditors to watch the tax collectors, and then you have to hire regional managers to watch the auditors and build roads for the managers to travel on.
And suddenly, the ROI curve flips. You are pouring massive amounts of energy, money, and human labor into the system just to maintain the status quo.
Just to keep things from falling apart, not even to improve the standard of living.
Our sources point to the ancient Chacoans of North America as a perfect, isolated example of this dynamic.
The Chacoan culture, centered in Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest around 1000 AD, is a beautiful, stark illustration of the complexity trap. They lived in an incredibly arid, harsh desert environment.
To survive and thrive there, they became master problem solvers. They engineered their way out of the desert's limitations.
They built these massive, multi-story stone structures called great houses. Some of them had hundreds of rooms.
And they engineered an incredibly complex network of dead straight roads radiating out of the canyon to manage scarce water resources and to transport massive timber logs from mountain ranges dozens of miles away.
All without wheeled vehicles or beasts of burden.
It was an absolute engineering marvel. They created a flourishing oasis of complexity. But as their population grew and their society became more intricate, the baseline maintenance cost of this system became staggering.
Every new slight fluctuation in rainfall, every minor drought required them to dig deeper wells, organize longer and more expensive trade expeditions for food, and manage increasingly complex water distribution systems.
The energy required to simply keep Chaco Canyon functioning grew heavier every year, until eventually the system was just too expensive in terms of human labor and resources to keep running.
And what did they do? And this is the key. They didn't all die in some dramatic, fiery apocalypse. The archaeological record doesn't show a massive massacre.
They just walked away. They simply stopped maintaining the great houses, dispersed into smaller nomadic bands, or integrated into less complex farming communities along the rivers.
And this leads us to Tainter's most radical perspective-shifting insight. It is a complete redefinition of the word collapse itself.
We usually think of collapse as a tragedy, a failure, an apocalypse.
Right. But Tainter says collapse is not a failure at all.
Wait, really? Explain that.
Tainter argues that collapse is an automatic, entirely rational, and mathematically predictable process of a society simplifying itself in order to survive.
Simplifying itself.
When the maintenance cost of a society's complexity exceeds the energy surplus available to it, the most logical, rational thing for the people in that society to do is to shed the complexity.
Yeah.
They drop the expensive bureaucracy because it is no longer providing a positive return on investment.
I want to use an analogy here to make this super clear because I think everyone can relate to this. Let's expand on the backyard garden analogy from our notes.
Go for it.
Think about it. You decide you want fresh tomatoes, so you start a small garden in your backyard. You buy a couple of seeds, you dig up some dirt, you water it with a watering can. It's cheap, it takes maybe 10 minutes a day, and a few months later, you get a basket of amazing fresh tomatoes.
The ROI is incredibly high. It's a simple, elegant solution.
But then you get ambitious. You want more vegetables, you expand the garden to cover the whole yard. But now the watering can isn't enough, so you have to spend hundreds of dollars on a complex drip irrigation system.
Then, because the garden is so big, the local rabbits notice it, so you have to buy expensive wire fencing.
Then specialized weeds take over, so you have to buy chemical herbicides and special tools. Eventually, the garden is so big you don't have time to manage it, so you hire a neighborhood kid to come over twice a week to weed it and check the water lines.
Suddenly, you look at your budget and you realize you were spending $500 a month and 20 hours of your own labor just to get a few extra tomatoes and some zucchini you don't even like.
Exactly. The complexity of your gardening system has yielded severely diminishing returns. The cost of maintaining the infrastructure has vastly outpaced the value of the harvest.
So what is the rational response? What do? You don't burn your house down. You don't cry apocalypse.
You just fire the neighborhood kid, tear up the complex irrigation lines, let the massive garden return to grass, and go back to planting a few easy tomatoes in 3 simple pots on your back porch.
You simplify. You shed the expensive complexity.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates Tainter's view of historical collapse. And if we apply that exact lens back to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, back to that scene in 476 AD, the entire narrative changes completely.
Right, the old man in the crimson cloak watching the barbarians walk in. It's no longer a tragedy.
Through Tainter's eyes, the Romans weren't necessarily conquered by superior, overwhelming forces. Rather, the Roman state had become the massive, overpriced, unmanageable backyard garden.
The sheer weight of the bureaucracy, the massive cost of the standing army, the crushing, inescapable taxes required to simply maintain the illusion of empire had become so oppressive that for the average Roman citizen living in the provinces,
The farmer in Gaul, the blacksmith in Hispania.
the empire was no longer providing a positive return. It was no longer a benefit. It was an unbearable, suffocating burden. They were paying extortionate taxes and getting zero protection in return.
So when the Germanic tribes came in, what actually happened? They essentially replaced a highly complex, vastly expensive, continent-spanning imperial bureaucracy with a much simpler, localized, low-overhead system of regional warlords and early feudal kings.
And for the average peasant farmer, that wasn't an apocalypse. It wasn't the end of the world. It was a massive tax cut.
A tax cut. The collapse of the Roman state was a necessary mathematical decentralization. The society simplified itself to avoid total energetic bankruptcy. It shed the expensive imperial layer because it couldn't afford it anymore.
It is a brilliant, cold, and somewhat comforting way to look at history. It takes the morality out of it and replaces it with math.
But now we have a dilemma, friends. We have 2 incredibly persuasive, beautifully articulated, but very different grand theories of why societies fall.
We have Jared Diamond telling us that collapse is essentially a moral and cultural failure, a choice driven by greed, environmental destruction, and sheer human stubbornness.
And we have Joseph Tainter telling us that human choice barely matters and that collapse is just the unavoidable mathematical inevitability of diminishing returns on complexity.
They seem mutually exclusive at first glance, but the best way to understand how these theories actually interact is to apply them both simultaneously to the exact same historical event.
Let's return to the Maya civilization one last time and look at it through both lenses. Let's set the scene vividly. Imagine you are standing in the great Maya city of Tikal around the year 750 AD.
This is the absolute zenith of their power and culture.
It is a breathtaking, bustling metropolis in the heart of the jungle. You are standing in massive paved plazas. You have towering limestone pyramids, painted bright red and white, rising hundreds of feet out of the deep green canopy.
You have a highly stratified, complex society where elite kings draped in jade and quetzal feathers are conducting massive trade networks using cacao beans as currency.
They have brilliant mathematicians calculating complex calendars stretching thousands of years into the future. They have astronomers mapping the movements of Venus with staggering precision.
And surrounding the city, they have an incredibly intensive, highly managed, engineered agricultural system of raised beds and canals feeding tens of thousands of people. It is the absolute definition of a thriving, complex society.
But fast forward just a little bit, to the period between 800 and 1000 AD, the engine of this magnificent society just stops. It seizes up entirely.
The construction on those massive monuments completely halts. Mid-sentence, the carving of historical dates on stone stelae stops, the populations in these massive southern cities plummet, and the jungle, which they had held back for centuries, literally swallows Tikal and Copan back up.
Now, it's crucial to pause and note, as our sources emphasize heavily to avoid historical misconceptions, the Maya people did not vanish. They did not go extinct.
Right, it wasn't a genocide. Millions of Maya people still live in Central America today, and even historically, cities in the northern Yucatan like Chichen Itza actually thrived later on.
But that specific, highly complex, top-heavy political system of the southern divine city-states, that structure completely collapsed.
So let's put on our Jared diamond glasses first. We look at the ruins of Tikal. How does the diamond lens explain the fall?
Through Diamond's lens, the Maya elites are the arrogant architects of their own doom. They aggressively and selfishly deforested their environment to fuel their plaster production, to build monuments to their own egos. This caused severe soil degradation and altered the microclimate.
Factor 1. Human-caused environmental damage driven by elite vanity.
Then, factor 2 hits. A severe natural climatic drought over several decades. And instead of adapting to this crisis, instead of rationing food, changing their agricultural practices to conserve water, or stopping the massive expenditure of wood and labor on pyramids, the Maya elite stubbornly doubled down.
They believed their power came from the gods, so to fix the drought, they built more monuments to appease the gods, and they waged petty, incredibly destructive wars against neighboring cities to capture sacrifices and steal dwindling resources.
Through the diamond lens, the Maya effectively chose to fail. They were culturally inflexible, selfish, and environmentally blind in the face of ecological disaster.
Okay, now take off the diamond glasses and put on the tainter glasses. We are looking at the exact same ruins of Tikal. How does the tainter lens see the collapse?
Tainter looks at Tikal and doesn't see arrogance. He sees an equation that simply no longer balances. The Maya were highly successful, so their population grew. A larger population demanded more intensive, complex agriculture.
To manage that complex agriculture and distribute the food, they needed a larger bureaucracy and priesthood. To manage the massive bureaucracy and keep the population unified, the kings needed to project more power and legitimacy, which meant they had to build bigger monuments and fight more wars to prove their divine mandate.
Every single solution to a problem required adding a new, heavy layer of complexity.
Exactly. And the baseline energy required to merely maintain this towering, precarious house of cards, the sheer volume of food, the millions of gallons of water, the millions of hours of human labor just to keep the city functioning, eventually hit the point of diminishing, and then negative returns.
The severe drought didn't kill them because they were stubborn. The drought was just a slight, final drop in the energy input that caused a societal engine operating at 100% capacity with zero margin for error to completely stall out.
So through Tainter's lens, abandoning the great city of Tikal wasn't a tragedy of bad choices or moral failure. It was a highly rational, entirely necessary decentralization. They physically couldn't afford the maintenance cost of the complex city-state structure anymore. The ROI was negative.
So the society naturally and logically dispersed into smaller, far less complex units in the northern Yucatan where they could survive without needing massive bureaucracies.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the most accurate answer for why societies fall is almost certainly a synthesis of the two. They're not mutually exclusive, they describe different parts of the machine.
Tainter brilliantly explains the internal vulnerabilities, the mathematical mechanics of the fall, and why a society becomes fragile and rigid in the first place due to the cost of complexity.
But Diamond explains the external triggers the spark that finally lights the powder keg, and the human psychological element, the stubbornness and elite isolation that often accelerates the crash rather than mitigating it.
It's the combination of the two that is so utterly deadly. You have a highly complex society operating at the very edge of its energetic limits with absolutely zero margin for error.
Suddenly, it encounters an external shock, a drought, a plague, a shift in trade routes.
And the leaders, trapped by their own cultural identity and fighting among themselves for elite status, are entirely unable or unwilling to pivot. So the math takes over and the system simplifies.
Which brings us to the end of our historical map today. We have covered a truly massive expanse of human history and unraveled some incredibly complex dynamics.
We really have. We started in the dirt of Rome, examining the sheer crushing logistical nightmare of overexpansion, watching an empire buckle under its own geographical weight and communication lag.
We saw how societies inevitably run out of vital currencies, whether it's Rome cynically debasing its silver coins into worthless copper, the Maya exhausting their arable soil, or Easter Islanders cutting down their very last tree to move a statue, destroying their ecological foundation.
We explored the terrifying math of elite overproduction, where we learned that the fiercest, most existential threat to a state isn't necessarily a foreign army, but its own highly educated, ambitious elites tearing the country apart because they are fighting over too few seats of power.
We examined Jared Diamond's stark warning about the lethal danger of cultural stubbornness, vividly illustrated by the Norse freezing in Greenland, clinging to their European identity rather than learning survival from the Inuit.
And finally, Joseph Tainter's brilliant paradigm shift, the idea that collapse is just the backyard garden getting too expensive to weed. It's a rational process of simplification when the ROI of complexity finally drops below zero.
What is truly fascinating, and what I hope listeners take away from this, is that societal collapse is rarely a sudden dramatic event, and it is almost never the result of single stupidity. It is a complex, almost biological process of diminishing returns, resource depletion, rigid hierarchies, and a failure to adapt to changing physical realities.
Which leaves me with a final, somewhat provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. If Joseph Tainter is right and collapse is just a society naturally, mathematically simplifying itself to save energy when things get too unbearably complex, what would a simplification look like in our modern world?
That is a very unsettling but necessary question to ask.
Right, because we don't live in a world of stone roads and aqueducts anymore. We live in a hyper-connected, incredibly fragile digital world.
Our complexity is the global internet. It's massive, energy-devouring server farms cooling thousands of processors. It's artificial intelligence models that require small power plants just to train.
It's perfectly timed, frictionless global supply chains where a single ship stuck in a canal causes worldwide shortages. If our technological complexity eventually hits a point of diminishing returns, if the sheer energy and resource cost of running the digital world becomes too high to maintain, how will we decentralize?
What does the backyard garden look like when we are forced to simplify the internet?
It is a profound thought experiment. Are we building a digital and logistical complexity trap right now that our grandchildren simply won't have the energy or resources to afford to maintain 50 years down the line?
It is definitely something to ponder.
So, friends, I invite you to reflect on these historical mirrors we've held up today. Look around at the symptoms in our modern world. The inflation, the intense political infighting among elites, the severe environmental strain. Is our current global society showing any of these ancient symptoms? Because remember, that old man in the crimson cloak, standing quietly by the gates of Rome in 476 AD, the people barricaded inside those walls thought their sheer complexity and history made them completely invincible, right up until the moment the fires were lit outside. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. If you enjoyed unpacking this massive topic, please let us know in the comments what part blew your mind the most. Hit that like button to help the algorithm know we're doing something right. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss our next journey.